I was joking with John and Johnny before the service that it's a good thing that we have coffee today, because I have practiced this a couple times and I haven't gotten it under an hour. So, best of luck. We're in Daniel. I just saw somebody walk out.
Does that mean you want me to stay in there?
You guys have freedom to go get coffee whenever you want. Will you pray with me as we come to God's Word? Lord, we are thankful that we come to your Word and we have the freedom to laugh and we have the freedom to be happy and joyful together as we sit at your feet and you teach us. Because you're that type of God. You're a God who sings over his children, who has said that I've done this so that you would have joy and have it to the full. So Lord, as we sit at your feet this morning, I ask that you would take the parts of our lives that we have built up barriers and that we're trying to keep ourselves from being vulnerable with you, and that you would gently pry that apart and speak to us. And the areas of our life where we're feeling wounded, that you would just gently care and speak those words of healing like you did over those men who died, those boys who died. And Lord, we trust you. We want to see Jesus more fully this morning. And so we come to you in his name. Amen. So we've been in the book of Daniel. You can turn over to Daniel chapter 5. And the last few weeks we were looking at Daniel 4. You can imagine that comes before Daniel 5. And what we have in Daniel 5 is, as I was thinking about it, it's almost like a what-if scenario. You can't read Daniel chapter 5 without thinking about Daniel chapter 4. The stories are very, very similar. It's almost like mirrors next to each other, but with a very key difference. One story, Daniel 4, ends with the restoration of the king being given his kingdom back and further greatness being added to him. And Daniel 5 ends with Belshazzar's kingdom being ripped away from him and his life being taken from him. Those are very, very, very different endings. But the way through the text, the stories that themselves are so similar. They both begin with a king at ease, a king prospering. They progress to God speaking and giving him a sense of unease and unrest. And then as his counselors come and try to help him make sense of that, they're not able to do it. And it isn't until Daniel shows up that Daniel's able to explain that this word from God is actually a judgment against the king for his arrogance of one kind or another. And the judgment is leveled against the king. The kingdom is taken away. But then it ends in two different ways. One gets the kingdom back. The other has the kingdom given to a whole other people. So these stories are so similar, and yet they end so differently. What's the difference? Why does it shift so much? Why is Nebuchadnezzar given a second chance and restored? Why is Belshazzar's kingdom taken away within one night of him understanding the dream? Those are some of the questions. That's the key question that I have running through my head when I read this. We are going to look at all of Daniel 5, which is a big chunk. So let's take a look at some of the text, and I'm going to highlight some key sections and summarize through as we go. So Daniel 5, verse 1, we're given this scenario. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and he drank wine in front of the 1,000. And then it goes on to talk about that feast. While they are there in the feast, they're starting to get inebriated. They're starting to lose some of those inhibitions, and they decide, this sounds like a good idea. Let's go get the cup of the living God, of the Most High God that we captured from his temple. And they bring it in, and they use those cups for their feast. And they share that with all the people present. And it says in verse 5, immediately, as they start doing this, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. So you have a picture of a terrified man. He goes on to call his counselors, and they can't make sense of it. He offers incredible rewards, but it doesn't do them any good. And finally, the queen walks in. And this is probably the queen mother, either his mom or his grandma, something like that. She comes in because of the commotion, and she says, calm down. You have a counselor who can help you, Daniel. He served the great King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, your predecessor. And he can help you now. Belshazzar says, I'm willing to try anything. So he goes and he grabs Daniel. He brings him in. After some opening pleasantries and extending to him the invitation, Daniel says, I'm really not interested in rewards, but I will tell you what it all means. And then, I think this is interesting. This is from Daniel 8. I'm not going to read all of it because of time and because of that hour-long sermon that's coming. But in verse 18 through verse 21, he does not interpret the vision or the words or the miracle. He tells the story of Daniel chapter 4. He reminds us, the reader, he reminds Belshazzar, the person receiving, he says, remember what happened in Daniel 4. The king was humbled. He was great. He was exalted, but he was humbled. Get to the end of that in verse 22, and he starts bringing it all together. And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you. You and your lords and your wives, your concubines, have drunk wine with them. You've praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. He then explains the riddle of the words on the wall. And he says, it is a judgment from the living God against you that you have been found lacking. You do not measure up, Belshazzar, and the kingdom is being taken from you and given to the Persians, the Medes and the Persians. So the story concludes in verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So that's Daniel 5 as kind of in an overview. We're thinking through, why does Belshazzar not get a second chance? You know, what is it about the sins of Belshazzar that make him so different or unique? Why does the story end so differently than it does in Daniel 4? There's an obvious connection between the two. Daniel is drawing us to see this connection as he recounts Daniel 4. So what's different? And as we think through the events that lead to the king's demise, I want to give us two caveats as we kind of think through this question. Two general principles that we have to keep in mind. And the first one comes from verse 21. In verse 21, Daniel, again, as he's recounting the point of Daniel chapter 4, and he says in verse 21, sort of the second half, he was fed with grass like an ox. This is Nebuchadnezzar. His body was wet with the dew of heaven. So he was humbled, so his mind was that of an animal, basically. Until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of man and sets over it whoever he will. So he draws us back into this truth that Nebuchadnezzar learned, that God is the one who's in charge of the kingdoms. God is the one who's in charge of humanity, and he gives it to whoever he decides. And so if we're asking the question, how come one king is given position of prominence and given a second chance? How come another king was taken down? The plain answer is, well, because God's in charge and he chooses to do that. And you don't get to ask him why. In fact, that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar realizes in 4, verse 35. He says, the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. He does according to his will among the host of heaven, among the inhabitants of the earth, and none, including us today, can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? He is in charge. Period. And that's a caveat that we have to make as we process through thinking about why did God act the way he did in Daniel 5 versus Daniel 4. This is a foundational principle for God's people trying to understand their relationship with God. When Moses was interacting with God, leading his people into this sort of rocky relationship that they had as they got started and they're going through the wilderness. He's praying to God in Exodus 33, and he's saying, how do we know you're with us? You're so mysterious. What are you going to do to make sure that we have a clear path forward? Like, how are we going to feel confident in our relationship with you? And he's asking these questions. And to that, ultimately, God says, I hear what you're saying. I will be with you. But just so you know, I show mercy to whom I show mercy, and I will be gracious to whom I am gracious. And then decades and generations later, Paul, as he's trying to make sense of how Israel rejected their Messiah, and now how Israel is under a curse because of their rejection of their Messiah. And this invitation is being given to the rest of the world to say, come, know this living God. And everybody's like, well, should we? Because look how he treated his people. He's like, no. The covenants of God are always faithful. We may be faithless, but the covenants of God are always faithful. And he goes back to Exodus 33:19. And he says, God will have mercy on whom he has mercy. And God will be gracious to whom he is gracious. So this is a caveat in the back of our heads that we can engage with this and try to see the connection between 4 and 5 and why Nebuchadnezzar was treated one way and Belshazzar in a different way. But behind all of that is a reality that God acts and he doesn't answer to us. The second caveat, so that's the king. He can put the crown on any pawn he feels like. The second one is that Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar are not starting at the same starting line. And that's his point in verse 22. He says, you, his son, Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's descendant, you have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. So Belshazzar is engaging with God, standing on the shoulders of the relationship that Nebuchadnezzar has passed on to him. Nebuchadnezzar is this pagan king that's interacting with God for the first time, and he's on this journey with Daniel of learning who he is over the course of his life. Ultimately, that leads to his humbling and his repentance. And after having received all of that, after having the royal decree of Daniel 4 being presented to Babylon, Belshazzar decides to take the living God's sacred items and use it in his public orgy. These are not the same activities. They are not the same starting points. And Jesus says in Luke 12 that God's justice involves and it includes the principle that to whom much has been given, much will be required, and to whom little has been given, less is required. The judgment will still be valid against both if we live offensive lives towards God, but God takes into account the amount of knowledge that we have of him, the amount of truth and access that we have to the word, to him. So those are my caveats. And then now as we go through and we think through, what was it about Belshazzar? What did he do that was so evil that led to his demise? These caveats should be kind of running in the back of our heads. So what led to his demise? 1, foolishness. So the story opens with 5:1. King Belshazzar is making this great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and he's drinking wine in front of them. And this is consistent with what a king might have done at that period of time, like to have a feast like that. But if we compare him to Nebuchadnezzar, we do not see Nebuchadnezzar engaging in this type of activity where he is loosening his inhibitions in front of his kingdom. And at this party is a rager. I mean, there's 1,000 different nobles present, and the king is bringing all of his concubines and his wives out, and they're getting drunk too. And it's this really fleshly environment. And you have these elements in it that are removing the wisdom that could be used, that Belshazzar may have had access to. When people are drunk, they don't make the wisest decisions. When people are trying to get, I don't want to be crass here. In an orgy, you're not making the wisest decisions. And these things are influencing him. He's letting himself be influenced by this. And we see him in the text. He's the one leading the charge. He's the one who is in front of the 1,000. He is the one who has set the party. He is the one who is making this all happen. And you compare him to Nebuchadnezzar, who is this grand king. He feels like an aristocratic, only child playboy in comparison. he's let his guard down. We see that foolishness echoed later on as the story continues in verses 11 and in 12, because it's the queen mother who has to come and essentially say, back in my day, and share the instruction of, she's like, there's a counselor that you have access to that apparently is not part of your court. There's a counselor who has wisdom that has helped your ancestor be great and magnificent. You don't even know who he is. Because in your foolishness, you, like another king, Rehoboam, have gathered a bunch of other counselors around you who don't have the wisdom of the ancients. So he's set aside, he's kind of pushed wisdom out. He needs other, like his mom essentially is the one coming in to help him get a hold of himself. And then we see him with really no self-control. In that proverb becomes almost a prophecy over Babylon, that the lack of self-control in the king leads to the destruction of the city, as if it had no walls. That foolishness leads to a specific type of sin, though, blasphemy. But before we get there, we have to go through the PowerPoint, and so I have to do idolatry first. Before we see the blasphemy piece, the sin that really gets honed in on, we need to see that Daniel's also drawing our attention to another condition, another reality about Belshazzar's worldview and his system, and it's idolatry. So in verse 4, we read that as he's gone out, they're drinking wine, and as they're doing that, they're praising the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So this celebration, this party or whatever, is done in essence sort of like before their gods as an act of worship to their gods, as they engage in this activity of drawing the different the temple's artifacts into that celebration. It's done as a way of worshiping their god. It's idolatry. And these materials are not the idols in Babylon where they would be like, oh, great God of gold that gives us gold, we worship you. And great God of silver that gives us silver, we worship you. These are, from the perspective of Daniel, he's looking at it, he's like, these people are like, great Marduk, we worship you. And he said, no, that's just gold. It's a God of gold. It's not Marduk. It's not anybody. And they're like, no, we worship the God of Nabu. And he said, no, that's just silver. It's a God of silver. It's nothing. And later on in the text, Daniel says as much, where he says that the God in whose hand is your breath, the one who's actually alive, who gives you life, you're ignoring him in favor of these idols. And so his foolishness, his idolatry, come together to create this perfect storm as he blasphemes the living God. Now, if you have like an accountability circle or a small group, where you're sharing the things that you're struggling with throughout the week, I'm going to guess that most of us don't like sit down and be like, so this week I've been really just struggling with blasphemy. Like, I was really blasphemous. Like, it's not the word that we use often to describe our sin struggles. But blasphemy is this idea of taking the sacred, the holy, the glorious God, treating him as mundane and commonplace, insignificant, less valuable, using him for our purposes. This is sort of blasphemy. And when we think about it that way, we actually struggle with blasphemy on a pretty regular basis, don't we? Taking the holy living God and treating him as commonplace, as just, another thing in our lives. The holy, living, glorious God, and being like, yeah, I could, I use God in order to do this other thing that I care about. And we see blasphemy in Belshazzar. I'm going to do that a bunch of times. In Belshazzar. In verse 3 we read, they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. The king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. So, one, Belshazzar is like, I'm going to go treat this sacred thing in the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had the wherewithal to say, okay, if I'm going to go collect sacred items, I'm going to go put them in my sacred temple. And Belshazzar's like, I'm going to go get those things and use them for my party. I'm going to go get those things and use them for my orgy because I think that that would be exciting. Or he may have said some other reasons for why he was doing it too. But he uses this moment and he treats the sacred as commonplace and insignificant and invaluable and not valuable. Beyond that, though, he's also submitting this glorious God. In effect, what he's saying is these things are going to be part of my worship now towards my gods. So some historical context to kind of make sense of this party a little bit. One kind of cool piece about this is we have all these ancient historians, and the fall of Babylon is, believe it or not, a pretty significant event. So it's recorded, and we know when that was. In fact, some historians will say this was the date, October 15th, 539 BC. There was a party going on, and Babylon fell. And it's like, wow, that's our story right here. Which creates sort of an irony or like a disconnect. Like, wait a minute, why was there a party going on in Babylon the very night that they were overthrown? What is that all about? Because it's not as though like a giant, huge Persian army just snuck up under the cover of darkness and they had no idea that that was going to happen. Right? That's not really how that works. More to the point, there's Belshazzar's father, who co-reigned with him, was in a military war with Persia. Like, it's an ongoing battle. And he had just suffered a significant defeat, which Belshazzar would have known about. And the last stronghold left for Babylon in its war against Persia is this city. So what is Belshazzar doing in this party? Like, what is the point to, like, how this is an ironic time to decide to host a raging 1,000-person plus others party. So you get different reasons for it, and the text does not say explicitly why. Maybe it's just sort of like nihilistic, well, we die tomorrow we live. I don't think the text supports that too much. But what I do see in the text is this component of worship. That he is reaching out to all this other God that they've conquered, right? He's going into his temple and he's grabbing the symbols of things that have been conquered, and he's bringing it out to the forefront of his whole political empire, right? He's putting it out in front of them and saying, as we worship our gods, let's humiliate the gods that we've conquered. It's like a propaganda machine, right? It's like, look, we've conquered Yahweh, that local deity over in Israel. He said that he was great, but we trust in Marduk. We trust in Nabu. We trust in Bel. And so we'll worship him, and we will force these other deities, and there's probably other sacred items that they brought out too. We'll force these other deities to join us in our worship of Marduk and Nabu. And this is blasphemy. To take the holy and living God and to say, come with me and worship my idols. For the sake of whatever reason, propaganda or whatever. Okay. We see foolishness, we see idolatry, we see blasphemy, and all of that leads to the demise of a king. However, it doesn't actually lead to the demise of the king unless it runs up against a reality, unless it runs up against an actual living God, and unless there's an actual judgment that comes from the living God. And we do end up seeing that. In verse 26, Daniel is explaining the dream, or excuse me, not the dream, but the vision and the miracle of the handwriting on the wall. And he says that here's the interpretation. In verse 25, first of all, it says mene, tekel, and parson. This is monetary language. This is like dollars and cents and stuff like that he's talking about. And he says this is what it all means. He links each of these words to their sort of word origins. And he says mene means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. God is actually engaged, and he is aware of what you are doing. And he has decided that the time has come for your kingdom to end. He says, tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And I personally think that is an incredibly haunting rebuke. because I think it touches at something very core inside of us. Like if I'm sitting with somebody and we're talking and I'm being like, I don't think that you're good friend material because you're not made up of the things that I value. Or I'm sitting and talking to, or like I'm sitting there with my dad or like a father figure, somebody, and that person says to me, I don't think that you have what it takes to succeed. Those things cut deep. And for the living God to assess you and say, you have been found wanting. You don't have what it takes. You don't belong. You don't ... It's a haunting rebuke. And then the final piece, there is a judgment. God issues a verdict. He has an opinion about everything that has been said, or everything that has been done, and this is how he's going to act. He takes the kingdom away and gives it to the Medes and the Persians. And to all this, Belshazzar's response is essentially, like I imagine him just like slow clapping Daniel, just like, all right, you get the kingdom now. Just like I said, that's a good interpretation. Appreciate what you did for me. Now, where's the robe? And putting the robe on him and sending him out. Because he completely, there's no action in the story at all that indicates on any level that Belshazzar acted based off of the information he received. And that night, the kingdom is taken away from him. So that's the story. That's Daniel 5. We see his blasphemy motivated by his foolishness and his idolatry leading to this end. It's just done. And we see the first fulfillment of the prophecy, that the kingdom of gold has now passed and is being replaced by the kingdom of silver, the Medes and the Persians, because God is the Most High who gives the kingdom to whom he chooses, for the time he chooses. What do we do with all that? Well, I got 3 sort of self-examination questions. The first one is, where is your foolishness opening up you to a path of sin? I noticed that this a lot in me this week, where I was like, wow, sometimes I make these choices. They're not right, they're not wrong, they're foolish. It's like, oh, that's a dumb decision. Part of the reason it was a dumb decision is because it then opens me up to a whole mental process that I didn't need to go down. It makes me vulnerable to a whole bunch of temptations that I didn't have to be a part of. And the foolishness is sort of like this precursor. It's like this gateway to us rebelling to the type of idolatry that Belshazzar is engaged in, or to like us running to the things that we think are going to satisfy, because we made a foolish decision earlier on in the day that prepped us for that. I'm going to let you guys fill that in, I think. I'm not going to give an example. Second question. So as we examine, like, where are the weak moments of foolishness that need to be examined? The second piece is, what is it really going to take for us to stop engaging in the idolatry? It's both foolishness and idolatry that get Belshazzar where he ends up. For us, I don't know if you guys have a little like cupboard where you have your little wooden statues or golden idols or whatever. I hope not. If we do, please come talk to me after the service. We'll have a discussion. But we do have entertainment cabinets that we open up and we go to be satisfied or to find peace or to find rest. We do have kitchen cabinets that we open up to start baking or to start cooking our comfort foods so that we feel more in control again, you know? We do have relationships that we run to, and we feel like if we can just get the affirmation we need, we're going to, be whole again. And every time we do that, we are going to God and saying, you're this valuable and you offer to be living water to me and satisfy me. I get that. But this other thing offers it, and it's more tangible, it's more accessible, it's better at providing it than you are. And we engage in the blasphemy of bringing God down and telling the whole world that the glories of my streaming service are more potent and powerful and life-giving than my God. So what is it going to take for us to stop running to our idols? For us to stop exalting our idols above our God? I don't have an actual answer to you for that. It's a question to look at Daniel 5 and to think about and to ponder and mull over. And I will point you to another passage in the New Testament, in Luke chapter 12. Oh, excuse me. No, that's the wrong reference. My bad. I don't have the reference for it. But Jesus says, to help us get a handle on how God sees sin, how he sees sin, how we should see sin and idolatry and all that stuff, he's like, here's what I want you to think about. Your hand, okay? It's a part of you. It would be better for you to cut that off and be in right relationship with God if that is breaking your relationship with God. If this thing is getting you to blaspheme the living God, then get rid of it. Cut it off, even if it's as an integral a part of you as your own hand. Because that's how significant this situation is. That's how deathly and deadly this is. And to us is given the story of Belshazzar. He wasn't going to do that. No way. And the kingdom was taken from him that night. And Jesus wants us to deal with it on the same level of severity. He sees sin as evil. Laziness and gluttony, things that, you imagine in, teenage life or whatever, just you sleep in and be lazy. God actually sees that as sinful. I was blown away with that, or thinking about that this last month. It's like, wow, there's laziness in me, and God is not holy, not good. He cares about it. He's engaged. He has an opinion. What is it going to take for us to agree with God and repent? Last thought. How do I put this? Where is this up here? Okay. I think this is my favorite part. Lady Wisdom. In Proverbs 1 through 4 maybe? The opening chapters of Proverbs. There's these different characters. And one of them is Lady Wisdom. And she stands in the exact same place that you would find the harlots or the prostitutes. And she's calling out and she's like, listen to me, you fools. Just listen to me. Please, I have wisdom. Live rightly with God. Okay, so she's calling out, and it's the wise thing to do is to listen to her. Do you guys see her in this story? Who is she? The queen. She's right there. And what is she doing? She's saying, my son, turn to the one who has the truth. Who is the one in the story who has the truth? Daniel. She's like, would you just go listen to the man who can help you know what's wrong in your relationship with God, who can help you see God and see truth and understand yourself and understand the conviction, all this stuff. And Lady Wisdom is crying out to Belshazzar, but he only half-heartedly listens. And to us, Lady Wisdom is crying out to us as the Spirit. The Spirit calls out to us, and he says, it is wisdom to come and find the one who is the truth. So when we feel helpless and out of control, like Belshazzar probably felt, invading Persian army, what am I going to do? I don't know what to do. I'm out of my depth here. God speaks to him, and there's this, he interrupts his party, and he's terrified. He's like, I don't know what to do. If that accusation leveled against us is, you have been found wanting. You weren't enough. And we feel helpless, and we feel out of our depth. The invitation, open hands from Lady Wisdom is come to the truth. Come, come, come. And you will find Jesus at the center of this whole thing. And Jesus is able to make the difference between the Nebuchadnezzar storyline and the Belshazzar storyline and give us the redemptive story arc. Because he's taken all of the judgment that Belshazzar receives, and he said, I'll do that for you if you'll come to me. And so here's how I'm going to end. In Matthew 9, there's this character who wrote the book named Matthew. Matthew is a traitorous, conniving, backstabbing prototype character. He's a tax collector. And he's got all of his friends who are the same. And Jesus walks up to him and says, "Come follow me." To the Belshazzar character, Jesus says, "Come follow me." And then Jesus goes and feasts with him and feasts with all of his traitorous friends. And as people are like, "What are you doing? Where's the wrath of God that we see in the Belshazzar story? You shouldn't be feasting with them. How could you be feasting with them?" Jesus says, "Well, the sick are the ones who need a doctor. And I'm a doctor. So what I came to do is to heal and restore." And he says, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." So that sense of helplessness, that sense of whoa, being found and lacking, is a great starting point for us to turn to Jesus and to acknowledge and to hear the voice of wisdom, to hear his voice that says, "Come follow me. I came for people who are exactly like you." Exactly like you. Let's pray.